You're listening to Puma Podcast.
Not too many people think of it as an economic issue, but in fact, education has a very large bearing on our economic future. If our learning poverty rate is 90%, meaning 9 out of 10 grade 5 students can't understand what they are reading, then that really spells a huge problem for the future of the labor force, for the future of our productivity as a nation, and our economic growth.
I'm Bella Perez Rubio, Puma Podcast, and you're listening to Teka Teka. This is part two of a conversation I had with Economist JC Punongbayan, one of this year's The Outstanding Young Men awardees. Part one covered his reaction to being one of the few economists to receive the award, and his mission to make economics more accessible to the public. It's not every day that you get to pick a TOYM awardee's brain, so I held on to JC a little longer and asked him about his book False Nostalgia, which debunks economic lies spread by the Marcos Sr. dictatorship. We also talked about some of the economic issues ruling our headlines. Some of them I've covered in my own line of work, but haven't had the chance to think through, and to be honest, don't exactly feel qualified to break down for you all. I thought you might like to hear what JC had to say. Over the course of researching for this book, you put in several years of work. What was something that personally surprised you or caught you off guard to learn about the propaganda of the Marcos Sr. administration?
Well, one of my favorite anecdotes was the bankruptcy of the Central Bank of the Philippines. Because during martial law, Marcos Sr. essentially instructed the central bank as well as many other government financial institutions to lend to many of the cronies. However, a lot of those proceeds were pocketed by the cronies. And in the end, these were loans that were not paid back to the financial institution. So that by the end of the martial law dictatorship, the Central Bank of the Philippines lost about 300 billion pesos. And that is quite ironic because the central bank has the monopoly of printing money, right? So they had that monopoly of printing money. They're the only ones who can print money, and yet they still lost 300 billion pesos. Even now, that's a huge sum, but even more so back then. And that's because of the mismanagement of the Marcos dictatorship. It came to the point as well that we ran out of dollars, our international reserves, because again of the mismanagement of the Marcos dictatorship. And they padded the books of the central bank to hide that fact. And it was later discovered, and that led to prolonged negotiations with our creditors. So that's exactly the reason why we no longer call it the Central Bank of the Philippines, because we created an entirely new monetary authority called the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, precisely so that we can distance ourselves from the bad past during the Marcos dictatorship. So that's a brief history of the Bangko Sentral, and that's one of the things I learned as I research on this topic.
And are you seeing any parallels from that time and this administration?
Yes, unfortunately, Bella. That's part of the opposition of many economists, including myself, to the Maharlika Investment Fund, because it's also scheme of the government to get money from government financial institutions, this time around from the Land Bank of the Philippines and the Development Bank of the Philippines, and also, by the way, the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. So the law that created the Maharlika Investment Fund forced these financial institutions to give up billions of pesos of capital in order to finance the seed fund for the Maharlika Investment Fund. And yet, until now, almost a year since the law was passed, nothing is still happening. They're not doing anything with the money, and they're still figuring out the rules that they will comply with in order to invest in whatever investments they want to put money in. So I think it's a huge waste and a huge risk. by the way, to these government financial institutions. And even the Land Bank and the DBP have already asked for their money back because they are seeing that their money is not being spent anyway. So, and they need that money for their own initiatives and their own mandate. So I think there are parallels. That's just one of the parallels that we are seeing between Marcos Sr. and Marcos Jr.
And how are you thinking through this renewed push for charter change?
What we're seeing is that there's too much hand waving that's happening in the discussions. And I think that's an effort to distract our people from the fact that there's very little evidence actually in support of economic charter change. One of the main arguments they use is that apparently they have this study showing that if you open up the constitution, that will allow in more foreign direct investments. However, when you look at the big picture, if you do a statistical exercise, you crunch the numbers, and you include all ASEAN countries, for example, you will see that there's a very tenuous link between how restrictive our laws are and the inflow of foreign direct investments. The bottom line is that for foreign direct investments to come in, you need to address many of the other factors that investors are looking at, including the ease of doing business, rule of law, the extent of corruption and red tape, the lack of public infrastructure, the cost of energy, and many other factors. So you need to address them first. And even if you open up the constitution, that will do little to promote foreign direct investments. Put another way, if you fix corruption and red tape and all of the other things, that will have a bigger impact on foreign direct investments. However, the proponents of economic charter change are kind of downplaying that message from the evidence and just focusing or cherry picking the results concerning equity restrictions in the Constitution. And they are kind of treating it as a panacea or cure all for many of our economic woes, when in fact the data is saying otherwise. So we need more sober and careful assessment of the data. And the thing is, there's a non-zero probability that economic charter change will really push through and lead to a referendum or plebiscite in the coming months. So yeah, we need to familiarize ourselves with the arguments for or against it and study the data more carefully.
We'll pause here. Later, JC talks education and answers my question about a glowing piece a London based magazine wrote about the state of our economy.
While I have you, I just wanted to ask, in your field in particular, is there anything happening or something that you're following that you feel the general public should be following more closely or trying to learn more about? Something critical that's maybe not receiving as much coverage that maybe we should watch out for?
There are many things I'm following and many risks to our future growth and development. But I think one of the most pressing would be the education crisis that we are facing. Not too many people think of it as an economic issue, but in fact, education has a very large bearing on our economic future. If our learning poverty rate is 90%, meaning 9 out of 10 grade 5 students can't understand what they are reading, then that really spells a huge problem for the future of the labor force, for the future of our productivity as a nation and our economic growth. So all of us should be invested in education issues. And there are so many crises that intersect with education, like climate change, like what's happening right now. If it's too hot out there because of the especially hot El Nino this year, it disrupts education, and that will spell trouble as well for the current children who are unable to focus on their studies. That has an impact on their future. income and prospects as well. But I think education is at the heart of many of our ills as a nation, and we should be paying more attention to it.
I saw this Economist story from last week. It was basically a story about how well positioned our economy currently is, and in particular, how well defended we are against the possible turmoil of a Trump presidency, which I think is a major concern for a lot of countries. In general, do you agree with the sentiment that our economy is in a very good place? We're steadily getting richer and is well defended against, possible turmoil in American politics?
Oh, that's actually the subject of my latest column, Bella. I agree with some of the points made, but I think it's important to nuance many of the other points that were made. For example, the article said that we're growing without fanfare. Well, that's true. We should also compare our progress with our neighboring ASEAN counterparts. Vietnam, for example, already overtook us in terms of average incomes as far back as 2020. So the average Vietnamese right now is already richer than the average Filipino, when in fact, just a few decades ago, Vietnam was a lot poorer than us. So Vietnam is doing a lot of good things that somehow we should also be emulating. And what are those things? They are investing a lot in both their physical infrastructure as well as human capital. So education, they focus a lot on education. So that the learning poverty rate in Vietnam is on the other extreme. It's very low compared to our 90%. So I think we should be taking a leaf or two out of the playbook of Vietnam if we want to grow fast in the coming decades.
And that was today's episode of Teka Teka. Again, I'm Bella Perez Rubio. This is part 2 of a wide-ranging conversation I had with JC Punongbayan, covering his TOYM Award and his advocacy of making economics more accessible. Look up part 1 of this story from last week if you'd like to hear more. And if you enjoyed the conversation in this episode, let us know in the episode comments if you're listening on Spotify or on our socials at Teka Teka Pod on X, at Puma_podcast on Instagram, and Teka Teka on Facebook. And be sure to check out Usapang Econ, JC's podcast with us. Piroy Blanco edited this episode. Our executive producer is Jill Caro, and our editor-in-chief is Carl Javier. Thanks for listening.